back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And so I want to say a few things to set the stage. Aristotle himself was an ancient Greek philosopher, just like Plato, who we had previously studied. And in fact, there's a relationship between these two thinkers. So just as Plato learned from Socrates, so Aristotle learned from Plato. And Aristotle himself was a wide-ranging intellect who wrote on almost every subject you can imagine, from rhetoric to cosmology to biology to physics and metaphysics. But in this book, he gives forth his most complete and most famous statement of ethics or morality, or more generally, how a human being ought to live. And the first thing you might wonder about is, what is going on with the title of this book? What is the word Nicomachean? What is that a reference to? Well, it's largely believed that this is a reference to his son, Nicomachus, and we can see the book as sort of being dedicated to his son. And I think the reason Aristotle does that is not just a personal reason. In fact, I think he has a sort of philosophical reason for doing so. Because as we read the Nicomachean Ethics, what we're going to see is that Aristotle is essentially discussing what is the fundamental purpose or function of a human life. What are the goods we should be pursuing? What is the way we should live? And for Aristotle, to answer that question, we need to know something about human nature. We need to know, what is a human being? What is it that makes human beings distinctive? And once we understand that, then we can understand how a human being ought to live in order to fulfill its proper function, its proper role, and its purpose. Now, what does that have to do with dedicating the work to his son? Well, in essence, I think we can see a connection between, for Aristotle, ethics and parenting. So, if you think about being a parent, it's not largely thought of in these sorts of terms as having real philosophical import. Usually we think of parenting as, at least on a day-to-day level, more about making sure you have the means necessary to care for your child. Are they fed? Are they clothed? Are they being educated properly? That sort of thing. But there's also deep philosophical questions that are embedded in parenting. Because when you're a parent, you're responsible for the well-being and guiding another human person. And of course, how can you guide another person if you don't know what a human person should be oriented toward? If you have no idea how a human being should live their life, then how can you guide another human being? How can you give guidance to a child who's trying to make their way in the world? So I think what this shows is that when you think about the relationship between a parent and a child, guiding a child to happiness and flourishing, there are deep philosophical questions. And so in order to do that properly, we need to think carefully about what fundamentally is the purpose of a human life. And in this video, we're going to look at just a few of the beginning chapters of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he starts to lay out these points. So let's begin by looking at, in fact, the very first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics. Here's what Aristotle tells us. He says, every skill and every inquiry, and similarly every action and rational choice, is thought to aim at some good. Okay, now this is a broad general statement about essentially everything you do, every undertaking that you pursue. So every skill you develop, every question you ask, every act you take, and every choice you make is thought to aim at some sort of good. There's some reason or purpose for every single thing you do. Now we're going to have to think more carefully about that. But it's also worth thinking about, okay, well, what does this imply about what our lives should ultimately be aiming at? So every skill, every action you do has some sort of purpose. And as we see what Aristotle says in the next part of that sentence, is that, and so therefore, the good has been aptly described as that at which everything aims. So he just previously told us in the first part of that sentence that every action you take, every skill, every inquiry, every choice aims at some sort of good. And of course, as we'll see in a moment, he gives some examples. You can think of many actions, many inquiries. So Going to school is one. Eating a turkey sandwich for lunch, mowing the lawn, studying philosophy, developing a friendship. These are all things that you do, and all of those have some sort of purpose. Okay. Now, not only that, he says, well, remember what our question was. Our question was, what is a human life well lived? What is that like? What is the ultimate good that a human life should be oriented toward? And Aristotle describes it again as the following. The good has been aptly described as that at which everything aims. So all the individual actions and choices we make have their particular goods. So the end of, having a conversation with a friend is building a friendship. The end of mowing the lawn is making sure your grass and your yard looks good and doesn't get overgrown. The end of eating a turkey sandwich is nourishment for your body. So every activity has some particular end. But then he also says, this gives us guidance to know what the ultimate aim of our life is. It's whatever all those actions aim at. Whatever it is that every single thing you do ultimately aims at and is trying to achieve, that is what we say is the good for a human being. So, notice, when he makes this claim, he's saying that there is some commonality to all the things you do, no matter how different they are. Going to school and mowing the lawn and having a conversation with your friend and eating a turkey sandwich not only have their particular ends, but they are all going towards something greater. And whatever that greater thing is, that is the good of a human life. And you might call it the final end. So in this diagram here, I've got, there are intermediate ends. There are things we're achieving sort of directly on the way to that final good. Nourishing the body, developing a friendship, making sure a yard looks good. But whatever it is that's the ultimate good that makes sense of all those things, that is the final good. It's the good of a human life. Okay, now we should pause here and think about this for a moment. And there's a couple things to think about. The first thing I want to think about is, do you think it is in fact the case that every skill, inquiry, action, or choice aims at some good? Remember, that was the very first clause of that first sentence. And you might think of a couple ways in which that doesn't in fact quite seem to be right. And the first thing you might think about is there any sense in which you can imagine actions that are totally random, chaotic, or arbitrary? For instance, I can think of my son, who is roughly 1.5 years old at the time I'm recording this video. I can think of my son and many of the things they can do. I can come up with really no explanation for what he's doing. It just, from my point of view, it just seems completely indecipherable. I can't relate to his actions. I can't explain his actions. Not everything. I mean, sometimes he clearly wants to eat and he points at the fridge. I know exactly what he's doing. But other times I really can't make sense of at all what he's doing or if he has any goal in mind. And with young children, this isn't especially uncommon. And so we might say to Aristotle, well, wait a minute, does every action really aim at some good, or some action just fundamentally arbitrary, chaotic? Now, for Aristotle, this is not the case. He thinks every action and every choice has some good. Everything has a purpose. It's actually just a fundamental part of Aristotle's worldview. But I think we can defend him somewhat on this point, and I think, in the case of a very young child, we might say that child's not really engaging in action, is not really engaging in choice. To engage in action or choice, you need reason, you need to sort of be able to sort through your desires and the things you want and think about the best way to get there. And this is a capacity that's developed over time that hopefully as you become an adult, you're able to master and execute very well. So I don't think he has in mind, for instance, when he talks about action and choice, the ways in which very young children or non-human animals, for instance, behave. I think he's thinking about the sort of rational actions that are more characteristic of adult human beings. But you might also say, well, fine, let's say every action has a purpose. Everything that we do has some sort of end goal or purpose. Does it follow that it aims at some good? Remember, the first part of that sentence says, every skill, every inquiry, action, and choice is thought to aim at some good. Now, what does that mean, some good? Does that mean a good thing, morally speaking? Because clearly that doesn't seem to be the case, right? People lie and they steal and they murder other people. It's not like everything we do is something good. But of course, they might explain that to say, well, look, by good, we don't necessarily mean morally good in the highest sense, just something that's, as he says, thought to be good. So you might say, well, look, why did this person commit a horrible crime? Well, it served their self-interest to help them get money, or it helped them exact revenge, and they thought this was good for them. It very well may not be the highest good for a human being, but there's still a purpose. There's some good they thought they were getting out of it. Now, of course, another way you might challenge this is, if we think about, is it possible that someone doesn't even have a sort of self-interested good in mind? Do some people sometimes do actions simply for the sake of chaos, not even because they think they'll get anything out of it, just to see destruction, just to see pain and suffering? Now, this would be a highly sort of disturbed individual, perhaps much like the psychopath that I discussed in the previous video. And here I'm reminded of that quote from The Dark Knight where the Joker says that some people just like to see the world burn. And if in fact there are people like that, we might wonder, is there a sense in which some actions don't actually aim at any good at all and are not even thought to aim at any good? Now, so this is clearly, although here we're on the fringe, right? So even if Aristotle's statement can't completely encapsulate those sorts of people, those sorts of actors, this is not the common sort of person. No matter what we think about the word every in the sentence, clearly it is the case that the vast majority of our actions have this structure. We make a choice, we do some action for the sake of some sort of good. Okay, now I want to call your attention also to another point that he makes in this initial paragraph. He says when we think about this structure, there are activities we engage in, and then there are also ends in addition to the activities, or products. And he says the products are by nature better than the activities themselves. So think about just the simple example I gave of mowing your lawn and having a nicely cut and manicured lawn. So you engage in the activity of mowing your lawn for the sake of having a yard that looks nice. And what is superior here? Well, what is superior is the end you're trying to achieve. What is superior is having the yard that looks good. Because, of course, you wouldn't engage in mowing the lawn for its own sake. You're only doing that for the sake of having a nice lawn. And the same goes for having a conversation with a friend or eating a turkey sandwich, right? You wouldn't eat a sandwich if it didn't nourish you, etc., etc., etc. So we have this basic structure. Everything we do aims at some good, in particular, and all the actions we take in our life as a whole must aim at some final good which explains them all. And in all cases, the ends, the products, are always better, they're always more important than the activities themselves. Okay, so we have this basic structure. Now, he gives a few examples to illustrate this point. I give a few of mine, but here are the examples he uses. He says, if you think about the activity of medicine, it's for the sake of health. Shipbuilding is for the sake of a ship. Military science for the sake of victory. Domestic economy for the sake of wealth. And all these particular ends must in some sense serve the good, whatever is the highest good for a human being. Which in fact is just his purpose in writing this book, is to figure out what is that good. Now, he says something also about the nature of this final good. So I want to read through this passage. He says, but when any of these actions, skills, or sciences comes under some single faculty, as bridle making and other sciences concerned with equine equipment come under the science of horsemanship, and horsemanship itself and every action in warfare come under military science, and others similarly come under others, then in all these cases the end of the master science is more worthy of choice than the ends of the subordinate sciences, since these latter ends are pursued also for the sake of the former. So what is he telling us here? He gives us this example where we imagine a sort of chain of actions, of activities and ends leading ultimately to what he calls the good. So for instance, the art of bridle making bridles that allow you to ride on horses, is for the sake of horsemanship. Then you say, well, why do we care about being able to ride horses? Why do we care about horsemanship? Because it helps us engage in military conflict. So it's for the sake of military science. Why do we care about being able to conduct war well? Why do we care about the military science? Because we want to achieve victory. And as always, every single action we perform is for the sake of what Aristotle calls the good. Now, the important thing he says here is that in all these cases, the end of the master science is more worthy of choice than the ends of the subordinate sciences. So in this structure, he says there's a master science or a master end, the good. This is the final thing we're attempting to achieve. And then there's the subordinate ends or activities. These are the means we use to get there. And the point he's making is that these subordinate ends and activities are less worthy of choice than the master end, the good. Okay, so what does he mean? Well, let's just take one example here, and let's just look at bridle making and horsemanship by itself. So you ask the question, what is more worthy of choice, bridle making or horsemanship? Well, it would be very weird to say that, you know what, when I'm comparing these two, I prefer bridle making to horsemanship. Because remember, bridle making is the art of making the bridles that you need to ride a horse. But if there was no art of horsemanship, if we didn't need to ride horses, then why would we need a bunch of bridles? It would make no sense to make tons of bridles and then have no horses to use them with. So in this case, we say, look, horsemanship is the master end where bridle making is concerned, so horsemanship is more worthy of choice. But of course, horsemanship isn't as worthy of choice as the military science because we only need to ride the horses for the sake of engaging in military conflict. And military science, the only reason we need to engage in war is for victory. And so as we go along this chain, right, the less subordinate an end is, the more worthy of choice it is. The more important it is. And the more subordinate an end is, the less important it is, the less worthy of choice it is. And I think this makes a fundamentally important philosophical point. Because now look at the very end of this chain. Look at victory in the good. So here in this particular example, we're talking about military victory. Now, if we agree with what Aristotle just said, then military victory is not as important as the good. And the good is whatever it is that makes human life worth living, that counts as human flourishing. And notice that if that's the case, then that puts some constraints on how we can achieve military victory. Because you can imagine there's all sorts of ways in which you could achieve military victory in a morally corrupt manner. You could directly attack innocent civilians in order to attain your goal of winning the war, which is known as terrorism. Right? There's all sorts of other nefarious ways you could achieve military victory and beat your opponent. But if this is true, then notice what you would be doing. You would be sacrificing the good for the sake of victory. But victory was supposed to be less important than the good. And what this means is that if we take this seriously, in any sort of endeavor, it's never going to be worth it to be successful in that endeavor if you have to do so by morally underhanded means. That would be to sacrifice what is more important for the sake of what's less important. It would be similar to saying, well, I'm going to make a bunch of bridles even though we have no horses around. It just wouldn't make any sense. So Aristotle's structure tells us something about what is most important in life in terms of our daily activities, but also in terms of the broader moral questions about how we should live. If everything is supposed to be aiming toward the good, toward what is good for human beings, toward human flourishing, then the good should never be sacrificed for the sake of anything else. Now, I'll just highlight here, one thing you're probably wondering at this point is, what in the world is this good? And we're of course going to get into that. In this initial video, we won't see how Aristotle defines that, but of course we will be getting into that, and in fact that is the major purpose of Book 1, is to begin to start defining what that good is. Okay, so we see Aristotle's basic structure, and I want to, if we look into chapter 2, in the first paragraph of chapter 2, he gives a little further insight into why he has this structure. Because remember what I told you, he says there's this idea that not only does every action have its particular end, but all the actions we take are going towards some single final end. And you might wonder, well, why does that have to be the case? Right? Why does it have to be the case that everything I do tends towards some single end? Why can't it just be that I just take a bunch of actions in my life and there's no single end they're all aiming toward, they're just for their own particular things? So I mow the lawn to ensure that my yard looks good, I eat a turkey sandwich to be nourished, I go to school to get a college degree, I go to work to get money, and none of these things are aiming toward the same ultimate goal, I just do them for their specific purposes. Why can't it just be that every action I take has another purpose and another purpose and another purpose to infinity, I guess, until I die? So Aristotle gives an argument for why this must be the case, and we can find it in this paragraph. So here's what he says. So if what is done has some end that we want for its own sake, and everything else we want is for the sake of this end, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, because this would lead to an infinite progression, making our desire fruitless and vain, then clearly this will be the good, indeed the chief good. So he's given an argument here for why there must be some sort of final or master end that makes sense of all our choices. And the idea is the way he's arguing, he's saying that it cannot be the case that all our desires, all our choices are just an infinite string with no final end. So we should wonder why that is the case. And so let's break down his reasoning. So P1, as I understand it, he says, imagine there was no final end. So there's no final objective or purpose to all our choices. If there was no final end of all our choices, then everything we choose would be chosen for the sake of some further end. So if there's no overall purpose to your life, then you just have a turkey sandwich to nourish your body, and you nourish your body so you can get up and go to school, and you go to school so you can get a degree, and you get a degree so you can get a job, so you can get money, and you keep going on and on and on. There is no final ultimate purpose to our lives. We just choose everything for the sake of a further end. Okay. But P2, he says, it is not the case that everything we choose is chosen for the sake of some further end. And notice the justification he gives for this in that paragraph. He says, otherwise all desire would be fruitless and vain. So what he's saying is that if every single action you performed was just for some further end and some further end to infinity, and there was no final end, there was no final purpose to our lives, then there would be no point in having desires at all. There would be no point in making choices at all. There'd be no point in acting at all. Every action you take would be completely fruitless and vain. The idea is putting forth is that if there's no final end that you're working toward, then no action you can be doing now or at any other point can have any meaning. Now, why would this be the case? Well, here's one example that helps me to sort of think about this idea. So let's say you decided you were going to run a marathon. So let's say you trained every day. You progressively built up the amount of miles you could run. You got your diet in order. Maybe you hired a coach to help you with your running technique. All the things you need to do. Okay, so you've been training for months and months and months. Let's say you're training for a year. It finally comes to race day. You show up at the race. They give you a little number. They put you at the start line. And right before they're about to begin, they say, okay, so this is actually not a marathon. Oh, so you're like, okay, is it an ultra marathon? Which I'm not exactly sure. I think it's like 100 miles or something crazy like that. Like, no, it's not an ultra marathon. You're like, well, what are you saying? This is a race with no end, the person tells you. there is no finish line. At no point are we going to stop the race. At no point are we going to evaluate who wins and who loses. You'll just be running for all eternity, I guess, until you die. So ask yourself the question, would it make sense in that case to begin such a race? Well, probably you would say no. Like, if there's no end to the race, if I'm never going to see if my work paid off, if I'm never going to see what my time is or how I'm evaluated in comparison to the other runners, if there's no end point to this action, then what is the purpose of beginning? Why would I engage in an action that I know is going nowhere? Just complete, utter, repetitive activity for all eternity. That would seem just completely pointless. So what does this tell us about Aristotle's point here? I think Aristotle is making a similar claim about our lives. If you knew that your life was ultimately going nowhere, if you knew that there was no fundamental purpose to your life, there is no ultimate end, there is no final good, then what would be the point of beginning? What's the point of taking any of the actions you're taking right now? What would be the point of living in the first place? If you're just going to do another action to another end, to another end, to another end, then that just sounds like repetitively engaging in pointless actions until your death. It sounds very much like the example of the marathon without a finish line that I just gave. And so this is why Aristotle says that if there is no final end, then everything we do is fruitless and vain. Everything we do is pointless. You may have at some point heard the phrase that life isn't about the destination, it's about the journey. One way to think about this is that Aristotle is completely rejecting that view. Life cannot be all journey. Life cannot just be going from one action to the next, to the next, to the next. There has to be some destination. Because if there's no destination, then there's nothing to make sense of what you're doing. There's nothing that gives a reason to anything that you're doing. There's nothing that gives a purpose to anything that you're doing. This is at least Aristotle's view. I'd actually be very interested to know what you think about this, whether you think life can be meaningful if it's just a journey, if it's just one activity leading to the next, or if life needs an overall final purpose. But if we agree with these two premises, then the conclusion Aristotle draws is that there must be a final end of all our choices, which he's been calling the good. And now combine this with the principle we saw previously, right, which I call the worthy of choice principle. So the more subordinate some end is, the less worthy of choice it is. The less subordinate some end is, the more worthy of choice it is. So we know that there's a final end. We know that the less subordinate an end is, the more worthy of choice is. That means this final or master end of all choice is the most worthy of choice. What this means is, whatever that good is, whatever it is that gives a purpose or reason to all our actions, that thing is the most important end. It's the most important thing in human life. And as I said previously, it would not make sense to sacrifice anything else for the sake of that end. Or it would not make sense, to sacrifice that end for the sake of anything else. Because if that's the most important thing, if that is what gives purpose and reason to our lives, then to sacrifice that is to sacrifice the reason we had for living and engaging in a human life in the first place. Okay, so I want to stop there. I hope this video, as always, was useful and at least a little bit entertaining, and we will pick up with our discussion of Aristotle in the next video.